A routine traffic stop in the middle of the night. A black man behind the wheel. An officer, tense and combative. Something feels off, but no one expects this moment to explode into a confrontation that will ripple across the community. The streets were alive, the usual nighttime hum of the city filling the air, the distant rumble of a bus, the occasional honking of horns, the faint chatter from a nearby bar spilling into the street. It wasn't a peaceful night. It wasn't even a quiet one. The pulse of the city was still awake, even at this hour, but it had a different feel. A tension lingered in the atmosphere, thickening as the flashing red and blue lights of a police car sliced through the haze of streetlights. Booker slowed as the sirens wailed behind him, pulling over to the side of the road. He glanced at the rearview mirror. A police officer's car came to a halt behind him, the headlights blinding in his mirror, cutting through the fog that had started to roll in. The hum of the city seemed to fade as he gripped the steering wheel. His fingers were steady, but his stomach churned with the familiar unease that always crept in during these moments. The world around him felt charged. The faintest sound of a radio playing from a nearby window, a dog barking in the distance. These sounds, though ordinary, seemed out of place now. The air felt heavy, thick with anticipation. Something in the way the officer had pulled up made him feel like this wouldn't be just another stop. He sat still, waiting. The officer didn't approach right away. For a few moments there was just the low hum of passing cars, the sound of tires swishing on the wet pavement. A siren wailing far off in the distance somewhere, growing louder before it disappeared into the night. Then the door of the police car slammed open with a sharp crack, cutting through the air. Footsteps followed, heavy and deliberate. Booker didn't reach for his wallet, not yet. He wasn't in a hurry to hand over his documents. He wasn't about to make the first move, not with that tightness in his chest. He knew the drill, but tonight felt different. Something about the officer's posture when he'd parked behind him, the way he'd stepped out of the car, didn't sit right. The officer, Donald Cunningham, approached the driver's side, his boots crunching against the wet asphalt with each step. Booker could see the glint of the badge on his chest as Officer Donald drew closer. The light from the street lamp overhead caught his silhouette, tall, broad, built like a man who'd seen his share of action. His uniform was freshly pressed, the sleeves rolled down neatly, but his body language screamed something else: impatience, tension, authority ready to snap. Booker rolled down the window slowly, watching Donald's every move. His gaze was cold, unblinking. "License and registration," Donald said flatly, his voice hard, as if delivering a command. Booker didn't immediately reach for the documents. He didn't flinch either. He wasn't going to let himself be rattled. Instead, he met Donald's eyes. "What's the reason for the stop?" he asked, his tone steady, but carrying the weight of an unspoken challenge. Donald's eyes narrowed, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. His lips thinned, and for a moment he didn't respond. His hand rested just a little too close to his belt, a subtle gesture, but it was enough for Booker to feel it. Donald's readiness to escalate. "License and registration," Donald repeated, his voice rising just a little, this time edged with frustration. Booker didn't back down. He still didn't move. "I'm asking again, why am I being stopped?" A vein twitched in Donald's neck. The seconds stretched, and Booker could see the man's jaw tighten. There it was, the familiar tightening in his posture. Donald's authority was slipping, and it made him angry. Booker could feel it, a crackle in the air between them, a moment hanging, teetering on the edge. "You're going to be difficult, huh?" Donald's voice cut through the tension now, sharper, more accusatory. He wasn't hiding his annoyance anymore. "License and registration now." Booker's fingers twitched, but he stayed calm. He knew the game. "I'm not being difficult," he said, his voice still level. "I just want to know why I'm being stopped." Donald's eyes flashed with something darker now. Anger, yes, but also a tinge of something else. Something almost personal. He straightened, his shoulders stiffening, but he didn't move. Not yet. The silence between them stretched thin, like a wire pulled taut. The sound of a car passing by in the distance, the rumbling engine fading into the background, felt muffled, as though it belonged to another world. "Get out of the car," Donald said suddenly, his voice low and dangerous. Booker blinked. His heart skipped. He was prepared for this, but hearing those words made his pulse spike. His instinct, that deep, primal voice in his gut, told him to comply, to just do what he was told, to avoid the inevitable escalation. But Booker stayed rooted to the seat, a calm refusal written all over him. "I'm not getting out of the car," he said, his voice steady, but there was a steel edge to it now. "I want a supervisor." Donald froze, then stepped back, his hands twitching. He hadn't expected that. The shift in the air was palpable. Donald's chest heaved as he processed the defiance. He stepped forward again, closer, his face tightening with rage. "You don't tell me what to do," Donald snarled, leaning in through the open window, his breath hot and sharp. "I'm in charge here. You're not in control." But Booker didn't flinch. He didn't react. His eyes never wavered from Donald's face. "I'm asking for a supervisor," he repeated, his words like a quiet command now. Donald took a step back, jaw clenched, eyes flashing with fury. His hand hovered over his belt again, closer to the radio this time. The second car arrived, the screech of tires cutting through the air, the headlights blinding for a moment as the vehicle parked behind Donald's. Booker didn't shift. His hands were still gripping the wheel, his heart pounding beneath his ribs. He could feel Donald's simmering rage. He could see the controls slipping from him. And now, with the backup car pulling up, he knew the moment of truth was near. This wasn't just a routine stop anymore. It had become something more. Donald looked at him one last time, eyes seething with anger, before he turned sharply toward the backup unit. His frustration was clear, his entire posture stiff with barely controlled fury. He wasn't done with Booker yet. But Booker? He didn't move. His gaze stayed steady, unwavering, as the backup officer stepped forward. He knew this wasn't just about a traffic stop anymore. This was a test, his test, and he wasn't backing down, not now. The tension in the air was unbearable now. The murmur of the city beyond the street was drowned out by the rhythm of Booker's heartbeat, hammering against his chest. His palms were damp against the wheel, but his eyes remained steady on Donald in front of him. Donald, standing rigidly outside the car, was visibly losing control. The uniform that once symbolized authority now felt like an armor Donald was struggling to maintain, his anger slowly seeping through the cracks. Booker didn't flinch when Donald barked, "Get out of the car." His response was cool, collected, not giving an inch. He wasn't going to back down, not now. "I'm not getting out of the car," Booker said, his voice quiet but firm, holding a weight Donald wasn't expecting. "I want a supervisor." For a long moment, Donald just stood there, staring. His jaw was clenched tight, the muscles in his neck bulging as he tried to keep his cool. The silence between them stretched, the world around them seeming to shrink until it was just the two of them, in that moment, caught in the tug-of-war of power. Booker's grip tightened around the wheel, his fingers just steady enough to stop them from trembling. Then it happened. With a sudden, explosive movement, Donald's face turned red as a beetroot, his eyes widening with fury. "You think you can just question me like that?" His voice cracked like a whip, sharp and full of rage. His hand shot out, grabbing the car door handle with a snap. "Get out of the car now!" Booker didn't budge. He remained seated, his posture unchanged, his gaze unwavering. He wasn't going to give Donald the satisfaction of seeing fear. Not here, not now. Donald's face twisted in frustration, a man on the edge, teetering between control and chaos. "Don't tell me what to do," Donald yelled, his voice breaking with the weight of his anger. He was close now, his breath coming in shallow bursts. The heat between them was so thick It was almost visible, like a fog that clung to the air. Donald Chan trembled as it moved to his belt, his fingers brushing against the baton. It was a small motion, but Booker could see it. Donald Chan trembling, with a barely contained rage, as though the baton was the only thing holding him together. It was all happening too fast. Donald pulled the baton out in a quick, jerky motion, the metal flashing under the dim streetlight as he pointed it toward Booker, his grip tight. "You want to keep pushing me, huh?" Donald stepped closer, the baton raised slightly, as if daring Booker to make the next move. "You're gonna regret this." But Booker didn't budge. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his hands in surrender. He stayed still, his eyes locked on Donald's. There was an unmistakable calm in Booker's gaze, one that only made Donald's anger burn hotter. Booker didn't take his eyes off Donald, though. He could feel the shift in power. Donald's face twisted into a mask of fury, his muscles rigid with frustration. The backup officer stepped out of the car, his presence an immediate shift in the atmosphere. For a brief second, everything stood still. Booker could see the anger in Donald's eyes, slowly giving way to uncertainty, a shift that only came when his power was being questioned by someone outside his authority. The backup officer took one look at the situation and immediately stepped between them, his hand raised to signal to Donald to step back. "Step back," the backup officer said calmly, his voice even, controlled. For a moment, Donald hesitated. The baton lowered just slightly, but his grip remained tight. Booker could see the war inside him, the struggle to retain the power he had so quickly lost. His shoulders were heaving, his face flushed with frustration and shame. But the backup officer wasn't having it. "You're done here," he said, his voice unwavering. The tension between them was palpable. He didn't need to raise his voice, but the words carried the weight of someone who knew exactly how to handle an out-of-control situation. Donald stood still, his body rigid. Booker could see the reluctance in his movements as he took a step back. The baton was lowered now, no longer a threat, but a symbol of failure. Booker stayed in the car, his hands still on the wheel, his breath steady, the tension in his chest loosening just slightly. The backup officer was already talking to the first officer, his voice low but firm. The anger in the air had dissipated, replaced with an uncomfortable silence. Booker let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. He wasn't out of the woods yet, but the immediate danger had passed. He stayed still, his mind racing with what had just transpired. He knew how quickly things could escalate, how easily his life could have taken a different turn. The backup officer turned to him, his expression softening just a little. "You're free to go," he said, his voice measured. It wasn't an apology, but it didn't need to be. Booker nodded, his voice calm but firm. "Thank you." He didn't need to say more. He didn't need to explain himself. He knew how quickly the situation could have spiraled out of control, but in that moment, standing his ground had been enough. As he put the car into gear and slowly drove off, Donald remained standing in the street, his shoulders slumped. The anger that had once consumed him now replaced by a quiet, painful defeat. But for Booker, this wasn't over. It was just the beginning. The battle wasn't just about this one night. It was part of something much larger. And as the city lights blurred behind him, he knew he wasn't the only one still fighting. The screeching of tires cut through the air like a sudden thunderclap, and Booker's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. Another police car had pulled up, this one with its lights off, but it was unmistakable. The sharp sound of doors slamming open followed. The backup officers stepped out, calm and purposeful. They looked like they belonged to a different world than Donald, standing just a few feet away from Booker, still fuming with frustration. The initial officer, whose breath had come in ragged bursts, looked over at the backup, his face twisted in disbelief. He took a step back from the car, his grip loosening on his baton. It was the first sign of retreat, the first crack in the wall of aggression he had built around himself. Booker stayed in the car, his hands steady on the wheel, waiting, still, as if he was watching a scene unfold that he'd already seen too many times. The backup officers were professionals. They didn't rush or make a show of force. Instead, one of them, tall and composed, moved forward with an air of quiet authority. His uniform was neatly pressed, his movements slow but deliberate. There was no haste in his step, no visible anger in his expression. This wasn't his first time handling a tense situation. "You're going to step back now," the backup officer said to the original officer, his voice low but firm, cutting through the tension like a sharp knife. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Donald's face turned crimson. The veins in his neck bulged as he swallowed hard, trying to keep himself in check. For a moment, Booker saw the internal battle on Donald's face, the struggle to maintain some kind of control. Donald's eyes darted between Booker and his superior, his fists tightening. He didn't want to give up the power he had tried to wield over the situation, but it was slipping through his fingers. The backup officer didn't wait for an answer. He placed a hand gently but firmly on Donald's shoulder, guiding him a few steps away from the car. "You've lost control of this situation," the backup officer said quietly, his voice unshaken. "We're handling this from here." The original officer opened his mouth as if to protest, but then closed it again. He stood there, his chest heaving, defeated. He was no longer the center of the drama. His authority had crumbled, exposed for what it was. Booker took a slow, controlled breath, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. He stayed in the car, waiting, his gaze flicking between the two officers, the sounds of their murmured conversation barely reaching his ears. The backup officer was calm, speaking softly, but with undeniable authority. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't angry. He was simply doing his job, something the first officer had forgotten in his quest to prove dominance. Donald, who had initially accosted Booker, stood to the side now, his fists clenched at his sides. The world around him seemed to shrink as if everyone were watching, waiting for him to make the next move. He wasn't the one in charge anymore. He wasn't the one calling the shots. And in that moment, he realized that his attempt to exert control over Booker had failed spectacularly. It was a bitter irony that Booker couldn't help but notice. Donald had tried to enforce his authority, to push him into submission, to force him to back down. But all it took was a single moment of resistance, a refusal to comply. Booker hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't fought back with aggression. He had simply stood his ground, asked for what was his right, and the whole situation began to unravel in front of Donald's eyes. As the backup officers spoke to the original officer, it became clear that Donald's conduct was being questioned. One of the backup officers pulled out a notepad and began scribbling something down, their words clipped and businesslike. The first officer's face reddened even more, his eyes shifting nervously. Booker could see it now, the way Donald was beginning to understand the consequences of his actions. This wasn't just a bad stop anymore. This was a mistake, one that might cost him more than just his pride. The backup officer turned to Booker now, his demeanor shifting from official to calm and reassuring. "You're free to go," he said, his tone warm but authoritative, like someone who had learned the delicate art of de-escalation. For the briefest moment, Booker hesitated. There was still a tightness in his chest, a knot of anger that hadn't fully loosened. He had done the right thing, he knew that. But there was still a small part of him that wanted to stay, to push for more. He wanted to make sure this officer faced some sort of consequence for his actions, for the way he had treated him. But he knew better. The night had been won, and there would be other battles. This one was over. He gave the backup officer a silent nod of thanks, then started the car. The engine roared to life, a sudden break in the tension. Donald, who had tried to force him out of the car, stood off to the side now, his hands still clenched at his sides. The regret on his face was unmistakable. As Booker pulled away, he didn't look back. He didn't need to. He could already feel the weight lifting off his shoulders. His dignity was intact. The moment had passed. But Donald, the one who had been so quick to assert his power, stood frozen in the street. He was watching Booker drive off, his expression unreadable, lost in thought. It was only when Booker was nearly out of sight that Donald's shoulders seemed to sag, his head falling forward in defeat. It was a small, quiet moment, unseen by most. But Booker noticed it. He noticed how Donald's world had shifted, how the walls of authority he had tried to build around himself had crumbled. The backup officer remained where he was, still calm, still composed. He didn't rush to take credit for the resolution. He didn't need to. He had simply done what was right. Booker didn't feel any victory in the moment, not in the way people might expect. He wasn't walking away with his head high because he had won against Donald. No, this was something different. This was about survival, about standing firm in the face of authority that so often overlooked his humanity. He knew this moment wasn't just his. This was bigger than that. As the city lights blurred in the distance, he thought about all the times people like him had been pushed down, ignored, and humiliated. And he thought about how many still didn't have the power to speak up, to ask for what was theirs. What would you do in this situation? Should standing up for your rights always come with consequences? We've all been taught to respect authority, but how far does that respect go when it starts to chip away at your dignity? When it feels like standing firm could cost you everything? What's the balance between compliance and resistance? We want to hear from you. Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Have you ever been in a situation like this? How did you handle it? Also, if you want to continue exploring real stories like this and join the conversation about justice and accountability, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. There are so many more stories to be told, and we don't want you to miss them. Together, we can keep pushing for change.